G'day guys, welcome back. What we're doing in this step is completely optional. What we'll be talking about is applying wax to your speaker cabinets. So in woodwork, it's very common to apply a finish like an oil, a varnish, and then on top of that you put a wax. And the wax, what it does is it makes your wood look really amazing. It's a really sort of organic look, it's very burnished, and it kind of beautiful feel to it. But what it also does is it protects the wood. So it stops water from soaking into the timber because wax is highly repellent of water. And what you can do is you can apply wax, say in 1 or 2 years time as well, so that you ensure that the timber is protected, as the varnish and the wax, if you do put it on, does sort of oxidize over time. So you can just, care for your speaker that way as well. In terms of waxes, there's heaps of types, but the most common type is beeswax. Beeswax is it's natural, it's from bees, and it's really hard wearing. So when you put it on, it just gives it a really hard surface on the top. Depending on where you are, you're gonna have different varieties of brands. So in Australia, we've got Feast & Watson. It's a great brand, but I'm not too sure if it's available in the US or Europe. If you can't get Feast & Watson, that's fine. Just get a beeswax that's made for furniture and get one that's stated that it's hard. You can get some waxes that are quite soft, so when they dry, they don't really form a hard layer. So look for something that says hard in it. This says hard wax. And anyway, I'm just going to show you how to do it. And if you don't want to do this step, as I said before, fully optional, but if you do, this is how you do it. So the first step that I highly recommend is to sand your speakers again. I know we sand them a lot, but what we're going to do is sand them at 1200 grit. The varnish that we put down before, it might have little impurities or like imperfections in itself where it's one bit's higher than the other. You might have some risen grain. You might have just tiny little bubbles or something like that. The 1200 grit will ensure that we knock them down, make them smooth. It also gives a good key for the wax to sit into as well. I highly recommend when sanding with 1200 grit, you do it wet. So you apply water and it acts as a lubricant so that any scratches are mitigated. If you do it dry, you probably will scratch your varnish. So put a bit of water down and just sand in the direction of the grain. And when you do it, you don't need to sand heaps. Like just go over each place, but 2 or 3 times, that's it. And just run your hand to make sure that there's no sort of high bits or anything that feels a little bit rough. And once you've done all your sides, dry it off. So take all the water with a clean rag. And then we're going to apply the varnish. So I'll give a little demonstration how it's done on one of the sides so that you can do the same if you want to. I've got the speaker fully varnished. I've got a glass of water with detergent in it. The detergent acts as a lubricant, so it helps allow the sandpaper to glide a lot easier. And what you're going to do, just place the water down. And then get your 1200 grit, your cork block. Make sure you do it with the cork block as well. Don't just do it with your hand because you want to keep that varnish really flat. And then sand in the direction of the grain about 2 to 3 times. One thing I would like to note though is make sure you're working on something soft. Now that we've done all the varnishing, the last thing we want to do is put a dent or a scratch in the timber. Get your sandpaper and just sand in the direction of grain. You don't have to push down heaps, you're just enough to knock any high bits. And then once you've done that, just get your sandpaper, especially if you've done a rounded edge, and just run it over lightly on the edges as well. And then at the ends, just use the sandpaper to bend around the corners. If you've got a square edge, I'd avoid doing this, just a really light nick on the corners, but you don't want to sand through the varnish. So be really careful if you've got a square edge. You might not be able to see, but I can see from looking at my speaker cabinet from this direction that it just made the varnish a little bit rougher. But what's going to happen when we put the wax on, it's just going to be really shiny, and we've got a nice key for the wax to sit into. Oh, that's really nice. And then what we do next is we apply the wax. So get yourself a rag. You want a clean rag. And one thing I've actually learned is if you're going to use a rag, avoid using rags with colors. Like sometimes the color can be taken out from the wax and put onto your bit, like onto your speaker, sorry. Get some wax on your rag and just sort of massage it in. You don't need huge amounts, but you just want to make sure that you can see it like sitting on top of the speaker. You can get everywhere, like make sure you get them on the edges. And then what you're going to do is let it dry. Depending on what wax you have, they will give recommendations. Feast & Watson say leave it on there for 15 minutes, let it dry and then buff it off. If yours says leave it on there for 20 or 5 minutes, do the recommendation. So just wait for that amount of time, and once you've done that, buff it all off. I do recommend though, is that you apply wax to all your sides and then buff it, because you know, it's going to take a lot of time if you just wait for one side at a time. So put all your wax on all the sides of your spigot cabinet, let it dry, come back, buff it off.